Welcome to another story where emotions speak louder than words. Here, each narrative is created to touch the heart, awaken feelings, and show that love can emerge in the most unexpected places. If you enjoy deep stories, gentle romances between women, and plots that hold your attention from beginning to end, subscribe to the channel now. We are walking together toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and your subscription truly makes a difference, so these stories can continue to exist. Now take a deep breath, adjust the volume, and allow yourself to feel. The story begins now. The first time Octavia Wren noticed her was through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 47th floor. Down below, among the geometric patterns of pedestrians crossing Madison Avenue, there was a woman sitting alone on a bench with a sketchbook in her lap, utterly still amid the chaos of Manhattan. Octavia watched her for 3 consecutive mornings before realizing she was looking for her each time she arrived at work. Octavia had built her empire with precision and calculated risk. At 38, she was the youngest CEO in her industry, commanding a pharmaceutical company that had revolutionized pain management. The business magazines called her brilliant. Her board called her ruthless. Her father, before he died, had called her exactly what he had molded her to be: untouchable. She wore her reputation like armor, each layer carefully constructed over 2 decades of proving herself in rooms that didn't want her there. Her office was a monument to control. Everything had its place. Her assistant knew never to move anything on her desk, not even a millimeter. The temperature was kept at exactly 68 degrees. Her meetings ran with military precision, never a minute over or under. She had systems for everything, contingencies for the contingencies. Emotion was a variable she had learned to eliminate from every equation. The woman on the bench appeared again on Thursday. This time, Octavia found herself abandoning a conference call to watch her. She was sketching something, her hand moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Her hair, a mass of dark curls, kept falling into her face, and she kept pushing it back absently with her pencil. There was something about her stillness that felt like a rebellion against the city itself, which never stopped, never paused, never questioned its own velocity. On Friday, Octavia did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She left her building in the middle of the day, without a destination, without a purpose, without a meeting scheduled in her calendar. Her assistant stared at her as if she'd announced she was joining a circus. The autumn air hit her face as she pushed through the revolving doors, and for a moment, she felt disoriented, like an astronaut stepping out of artificial gravity. The woman was still there, on the bench, though now she was simply watching the people pass. Octavia found herself walking toward her before she'd consciously decided to move. Up close, she could see the woman was older than she'd appeared from above, perhaps early 40s, with lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter rather than stress. She wore paint-stained jeans and a sweater that had been mended at the elbow. "You've been sitting here every morning this week," Octavia said, then immediately regretted how accusatory it sounded, how much like an interrogation. The woman looked up at her with eyes the color of honey, completely unimpressed by the designer suit and the tone that made venture capitalists nervous. "I have," she said simply, closing her sketchbook. "The light here is extraordinary between 8 and 9. It hits the buildings at an angle that makes them look less like monuments and more like questions." Her voice had a quality that reminded Octavia of old vinyl records, warm and slightly imperfect. Octavia didn't know what to say to that. In her world, buildings were assets, square footage, investments. They weren't questions. She stood there, feeling foolish, aware of how out of place she was without a purpose, without a transaction to complete. "I'm Iris," the woman said, extending a hand that had charcoal smudges on the fingertips. "Iris Merritt." "Octavia Wren." The handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary, and Octavia felt something shift in her chest, like a foundation settling. She pulled her hand back quickly, disturbed by the sensation. "The Octavia Wren?" Iris asked. But there was no awe in her voice, only curiosity. "The one who owns that tower?" She gestured upward at the building Octavia had just emerged from. "I don't own the building. I own the company that occupies 12 floors of it." The correction came automatically, a reflex born from too many legal depositions. Iris smiled. Must be strange, spending your life that high up. Do you ever feel like you're watching the world instead of living in it? The question wasn't confrontational, but it landed like a punch to Octavia's solar plexus. No one had ever asked her anything like that. No one had ever suggested that her success might cost her something. Octavia opened her mouth to deliver a cutting response, to put this stranger in her place, but found she couldn't. Instead, she heard herself say, "every single day," and immediately felt exposed, as if she'd confessed to a crime. They stood in silence for a moment, the city rushing around them. Octavia's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. She had a meeting in 10 minutes with investors from Singapore. She had a reputation to maintain. She had no reason to be standing here talking to a woman with paint on her jeans about feelings she'd spent decades refusing to acknowledge. "I have to go," Octavia said, but she didn't move. Iris nodded, opening her sketchbook again, and Octavia caught a glimpse of the page. It was a drawing of the street, but everything was slightly distorted, bent, as if the buildings were melting or dancing. It was beautiful and unsettling. "Same time tomorrow?" Iris asked, not looking up from her sketch. It wasn't really a question, more like a gentle dare. Octavia walked away without answering, but the next morning, she found herself leaving her office at 8:30, taking the elevator down, and walking out into the autumn sunshine. Iris was there, as if she'd never left, as if she'd simply been waiting for Octavia to stop pretending she wouldn't come back. This became their routine. Every morning for 2 weeks, Octavia would spend 30 minutes sitting on that bench, watching Iris sketch, listening to her talk about light and shadow, and the way the city revealed itself to people who bothered to look. Iris never asked about Octavia's work, never seemed impressed by her power or her wealth. She asked instead about the things Octavia had forgotten how to notice. Whether she'd seen the way the leaves were turning copper in Central Park, whether she'd tasted the first apples of the season, whether she remembered what it felt like to have an entire afternoon with nothing scheduled. Octavia found herself thinking about these conversations during board meetings, during conference calls with London and Tokyo. She found herself noticing things she'd trained herself to ignore, the way the rain sounded against her office windows, the exhaustion in her assistant's eyes, the fact that she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at something that wasn't strategic or performative. On the 15th day, Iris wasn't there. Octavia sat on the bench alone, feeling absurdly betrayed, as if they'd had some contract that had been broken. She waited for 45 minutes, missing 2 meetings, before finally returning to her tower. Her assistant looked relieved to see her, then concerned when she saw Octavia's face. That evening, Octavia did something she hadn't done in over a decade. She left work before 8 o'clock. She went home to her apartment in Tribeca, which had been featured in 3 design magazines, and felt like a hotel suite she was visiting rather than a place she lived. She poured herself a glass of wine she'd been saving for a professional celebration, and stood at her window, looking out at the city, wondering when she'd started feeling like a stranger in her own life. Iris appeared again 3 days later. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. Octavia felt relief so intense it frightened her, followed immediately by anger at herself for caring so much about someone she barely knew. "I'm sorry," Iris said before Octavia could speak. "My mother fell. She's in a care facility in Queens. I've been with her." There was no drama in the statement, just exhaustion and love and the weight of responsibility. Octavia knew she should express sympathy, should say the appropriate things people said in these situations. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Is there anything I can do?" And she meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in years. Iris looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Tell me something true," she finally said. "Not something professional or polished. Something that costs you something to say." The request should have felt invasive. Octavia had spent her entire adult life building walls specifically to prevent this kind of vulnerability. But sitting there on that bench, with the morning light doing whatever it was that Iris found so extraordinary, she found herself saying, "I'm lonely. I've been lonely for so long that I'd convinced myself it was the same as being independent." Iris didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She simply nodded, as if Octavia had confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I see you," she said quietly. "Not the CEO, not the woman in the magazines. You, the person who watches the world from the 47th floor and wonders what it would feel like to actually be part of it. Something broke open in Octavia's chest, something she'd been keeping carefully sealed. She felt tears threatening and stood up abruptly, terrified of losing control in public, on a bench, in front of this woman who seemed to see straight through every defense she'd ever constructed. "I have to go," she said, but Iris caught her hand. "Running is easier, isn't it?" Iris said. "I know. I've done it too. But eventually, you run out of places to hide from yourself." She released Octavia's hand. "I'm here every morning that I can be, whenever you're ready to stop running." Octavia went back to her tower, rode the elevator up to her floor, sat at her desk, and stared at the spreadsheet on her screen without seeing any of the numbers. Her assistant brought her coffee and backed out of the office quickly, sensing something was different. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. That night, Octavia did something she couldn't remember ever doing. She called in sick for the next day. She'd taken precisely 0 sick days in 14 years with the company. Her assistant sounded alarmed, asking if she needed anything, if she should send a doctor. Octavia hung up and felt something like freedom, though it was mixed with terror at the chaos she might be creating in her absence. She spent the day walking through neighborhoods she'd never explored, eating at restaurants that had no Michelin stars, sitting in a park watching strangers live their lives. She bought a book from a street vendor not because she needed it, but because the old man selling it had kind eyes, and she wanted to participate in a transaction that wasn't about power or profit. She felt like she was learning to inhabit her own body again, learning the language of a world that moved at a different speed than the one she'd been sprinting through. The next morning, she was on the bench before Iris arrived. When Iris saw her sitting there, her whole face transformed with a smile that made Octavia feel like she'd accomplished something more significant than any merger or acquisition. "You came early," Iris said, sitting down beside her. "I wanted to see what you see," Octavia said. "The light. Whatever it is that makes you sit here every morning." They sat in silence, watching the sun climb higher, watching the way it turned the glass towers into something molten and temporary. Octavia tried to see it the way Iris did, as a question rather than an answer. She found that if she softened her focus, if she stopped trying to analyze and categorize, something did shift. The city became less like a machine and more like a living thing, breathing and changing and full of stories she'd never bothered to notice. "I was married once," Iris said suddenly, "to a good man who loved me very much. We had a daughter. She was 7 when she got sick. Leukemia. We did everything. Every treatment, every trial, every prayer to every god anyone suggested. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in April while I was holding her hand and singing the lullaby she'd loved when she was small." Octavia felt like all the air had been pulled from her lungs. She turned to look at Iris, who was still watching the light on the buildings, her face calm, but carved with an ancient grief. "Her name was Luna," Iris continued. "She loved drawing, like me. She saw magic in everything, puddles, pigeons, the way shadows moved across walls. After she died, my husband and I tried to hold each other together. But grief is strange. It brought us to the same place but made us into different people. We divorced 3 years later. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because we couldn't bear to keep reminding each other of what we'd lost." "I'm so sorry," Octavia said, and the words felt inadequate, childish, meaningless against the weight of what Iris had carried. "I stopped drawing for 5 years, Iris said. "I stopped seeing the light, stopped noticing the magic Luna had taught me to find. I worked at a grocery store, went through the motions, existed but didn't live. Then one morning, I woke up and realized that by refusing to see beauty, I was letting her die twice. So I started drawing again. I started sitting on benches and watching the light. I started choosing, every single day, to be alive, instead of just breathing." Octavia understood then that the stillness she'd noticed in Iris wasn't peace. It was hard-won, earned through unimaginable pain. It was the kind of strength that didn't come from control, but from surrender to the things that couldn't be controlled. "Why are you telling me this?" Octavia asked. Because you asked what costs me something to say, Iris said. Because I think you've been hiding from your own life. And I recognize that because I did the same thing. Because I think you deserve to know that you're not the only person who's ever been terrified of feeling things. They sat together as the morning deepened, as the light changed from gold to white, as the city settled into its rhythm. Octavia felt something unfurling inside her, something that had been clenched tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. It was painful and disorienting, and felt exactly like waking up. Over the following weeks, their morning meetings became the architecture around which Octavia structured her days. She found herself working more efficiently, delegating tasks she'd always insisted on controlling herself, leaving the office at reasonable hours. Her board noticed. Her assistant noticed. The business press noticed and speculated about what was causing the subtle shift in her approach. Octavia started meeting Iris in the evenings too, after work, at small cafes and restaurants where no one recognized her or cared who she was. They talked about everything and nothing. Iris's mother, who was recovering slowly and fighting the transition to assisted living with ferocious dignity. Octavia's childhood, as the daughter of a man who saw her only as an extension of his own ambitions. The books they'd loved, the places they'd wanted to see, the alternate versions of themselves they sometimes wondered about. One night, walking through the village after dinner, Iris stopped in front of a gallery window. "That's mine," she said, pointing to a painting inside. It was one of her distorted cityscapes, all melting lines and impossible angles, beautiful and unsettling. "You're in a gallery?" Octavia asked, surprised that Iris had never mentioned it. "Sometimes, when I need money for my mother's care. I don't paint to sell, but bills are bills," she said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness or shame. Octavia looked at the price tag. It was absurdly low, less than she spent on a single business dinner. "That's not enough," she said. "Your work is worth more than that." Iris smiled. "Worth is a funny thing. To someone who needs it, who really sees it, it's priceless. To everyone else, it's just paint on canvas. I'd rather it belong to someone who understands it than sell it for more to someone who just wants it to match their couch." This was so opposite to Octavia's entire worldview, the idea that value wasn't determined by what the market would bear, that it made her feel dizzy. But she was beginning to understand that Iris operated according to principles that had nothing to do with profit or efficiency or strategic advantage. "Come see where I work," Iris said suddenly. "I have a studio. Well, it's more of a corner in my apartment, but still, I'd like to show you." They took the subway to Astoria, to a building that had seen better decades. Iris's apartment was small and cluttered, filled with canvases in various states of completion, jars of brushes, tubes of paint, books stacked in precarious towers. It was chaos, but it was alive in a way Octavia's pristine apartment had never been. "This is where the magic happens," Iris said, gesturing around. "Such as it is." Octavia moved slowly through the space, looking at the paintings. They were all variations on the same theme. The city, bent and reshaped by Iris's vision into something more honest than the steel and glass reality. In every painting, Octavia could see the question Iris had talked about. What are we building? And why? And for whom? "These are extraordinary," Octavia said, and meant it. Iris came to stand beside her, so close their shoulders were almost touching. "I paint what I see when I stop trying to make sense of things," she said. "When I let them just be what they are." Octavia turned to look at her. And in that moment, in that small cluttered studio with paint-stained floors, she felt something she'd been avoiding naming for weeks. It wasn't just friendship or admiration or intellectual connection. It was deeper, more terrifying, more real than anything she'd let herself feel in decades. "Iris," she said, and then stopped, not knowing how to finish the sentence, not knowing if she had the courage to say what she was feeling. Iris looked at her with those honey-colored eyes and smiled gently. "I know," she said. "I feel it too. And it's terrifying, isn't it?" "Yes," Octavia whispered. "I don't know how to do this. I've spent my entire life avoiding exactly this." "We don't have to rush," Iris said. "We don't have to have it all figured out. We can just be here, in this moment, and see what happens next." Octavia felt tears on her face, startled to realize she was crying. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried. Maybe at her father's funeral. Maybe not even then. Iris reached up and gently wiped the tears away with her thumb, a gesture so tender it made Octavia cry harder. They stood there, in that studio that smelled of paint and turpentine and possibility, and Octavia let herself be held while she fell apart in a way that felt like coming back together. Iris didn't try to fix her or stop her tears or offer false comfort. She just held her, steady and patient, as if she had all the time in the world. When Octavia finally pulled back, embarrassed by her loss of control, Iris just smiled. "Don't apologize," she said. "Crying is just evidence that you're still alive, still feeling things. It's not weakness. In my world, it is," Octavia said. "Then maybe it's time to expand your world," Iris suggested gently. Over the next month, Octavia did exactly that. She started saying no to obligations that drained her, yes to experiences that scared her. She went to art galleries with Iris, learning to see beyond the investment value of what hung on the walls. She met Iris's mother, a fierce woman named Margaret, who looked at Octavia with sharp assessment and said, "You're the one making my daughter smile again. Don't mess it up." She brought Iris to a company gala, an impulse decision that she regretted the moment they walked in and everyone turned to stare. Iris, in a simple dress she'd probably owned for years, looked more real than anyone in the room with their designer gowns and calculated networking. Octavia watched her board members assess this new variable, trying to figure out what angle Octavia was playing. "She's not what I expected," her CFO said, not unkindly. "She seems genuine." "She is," Octavia said, and realized with some surprise that she didn't care what they thought. Their opinions, which had once been the axis around which her whole world turned, suddenly seemed less important than the way Iris was standing by the window, probably analyzing the light, probably seeing something none of them would ever notice. But integrating two such different worlds wasn't easy, wasn't. Iris didn't understand why Octavia had to work 80-hour weeks, why a vacation had to be scheduled 6 months in advance, why she checked her phone compulsively even during their dinners together. Octavia didn't understand why Iris refused to let her pay for things, why she wouldn't accept help with her mother's medical bills, why she insisted on maintaining her small, difficult life when Octavia could so easily make it easier. They had their first real fight on a Tuesday evening in December. Octavia had offered again to pay off Iris's mother's care facility bills, and Iris had refused, again, and Octavia had finally lost her patience. "Why won't you let me help you?" Octavia demanded. "I have resources. I can solve this problem in a day. Why are you being so stubborn?" "Because I'm not a problem to be solved," Iris shot back, angrier than Octavia had ever seen her. "I'm a person, Octavia. So is my mother. We're not one of your failing companies that needs to be restructured. Sometimes people just need to struggle through their own challenges." "That's absurd," Octavia said. "If I can make your life easier, why wouldn't I? Because then what am I bringing to this relationship? I become another thing you've acquired, another dependent. I need to maintain my own dignity, my own autonomy. Can't you understand that?" Octavia felt like she'd been slapped. "Is that what you think? That I see you as something to acquire?" "I don't know," Iris said, and she sounded tired. "Sometimes I wonder if you're capable of connecting with people who aren't somehow in your debt or under your control. Everyone in your life either works for you or wants something from you. Have you ever had a relationship where the power was actually equal?" The question struck home because Octavia knew the answer was no. She'd chosen her entire life to be structured around hierarchies, where she was always on top, always in control, always protected by the distance that power created. "I'm trying," Octavia said quietly. "I know I'm not good at this. I know I default to fixing things instead of just being with people. But I'm trying to learn a different way." Iris's face softened. "I know you are, and I love that about you. But you have to understand that letting you in, letting you see my struggles, that's already vulnerability enough. If you start solving all my problems, you take away my agency. You make me small." They stood in silence, the fight draining out of both of them. Finally, Octavia said, "What if I promised to ask before offering solutions? What if I just listened, unless you specifically requested help? That would be a start, Iris said. She crossed the space between them and took Octavia's hands. I know your instinct is to fix things. I know that's how you show love in your world. But in this relationship, I need you to show love by trusting that I can handle my own life, even when it's messy. Even when it's messy, Octavia repeated, testing the words. It went against every instinct she had, but she understood what Iris was asking for. I can try to do that. They held each other. And Octavia realized that this, the negotiation, the compromise, the willingness to be uncomfortable, this was intimacy in a way she'd never experienced. It wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about seeing each other clearly and choosing to stay anyway. Winter settled over the city, and Octavia found herself experiencing the season in ways she never had before. She and Iris ice skated at Rockefeller Center, surrounded by tourists and children. They drank hot chocolate in Central Park, watching the snow fall. They spent a weekend afternoon at the Museum of Modern Art, where Iris explained why certain paintings moved her to tears while others left her cold. On Christmas Eve, Iris invited Octavia to her mother's care facility. Margaret was having a good day, lucid and sharp. They sat in her room, decorated with Iris's paintings and photos of Luna, and Margaret told stories about her life, growing up in the Bronx, meeting her husband at a church social, raising Iris to be independent and fierce. She gets that from you, Octavia said, and Margaret laughed, a sound like old silver. She gets the stubbornness from me, the softness she got from her father. Margaret looked at Octavia with those same honey-colored eyes her daughter had inherited. Are you going to break her heart? The question was direct, almost aggressive. Octavia could have been offended, but she understood what Margaret was really asking. I'm going to try very hard not to, she said honestly. But I've never been good at this. I might fail despite my best intentions. Margaret seemed satisfied with this answer. At least you're honest. Iris has already had one great love ripped away from her. If you're going to leave, do it now, before she invests any more of herself. Mom, Iris said, mortified. But Octavia understood. She looked at Iris, sitting there between them, and felt the weight of what was being asked of her. Could she do this? Could she let someone in completely, risk the kind of loss that Margaret was warning her about? I'm not going anywhere, Octavia heard herself say, and knew it was a promise. The new year arrived, and with it, a crisis at work. One of Octavia's drugs was being challenged in court over patent violations. If they lost, the company stood to lose billions. The board was panicking. Investors were threatening. The business press was circling like sharks. For 3 weeks, Octavia barely slept. She worked around the clock, coordinating with lawyers, strategizing with her executive team, managing the PR disaster. She missed dinners with Iris, canceled their morning bench meetings, responded to texts hours late or not at all. Finally, on a Friday night at 2 a.m, sitting in her office with the city glittering below her, she realized she was falling back into her old patterns. She was using the crisis as an excuse to retreat into the world she understood, where everything was about strategy and control and winning. She texted Iris, "I'm sorry. I've been disappearing again." The response came immediately, as if Iris had been awake too. "I know. I understand you're in crisis mode. But I miss you." Those 4 words, "I miss you," broke something open in Octavia. She grabbed her coat and left her office, leaving her phone on her desk, leaving the briefs unread, leaving the spreadsheets unanalyzed. She took a taxi to Astoria, arrived at Iris's building at 3 a.m, and stood outside buzzing the apartment until Iris, looking worried and confused, let her in. "I don't know how to balance this," Octavia said the moment Iris opened her apartment door. "I don't know how to be the person my company needs, and the person you deserve. I'm afraid I'm going to fail at both." Iris pulled her inside, sat her down on the worn couch, and said, "Tell me what you need." "I need you to be patient with me," Octavia said. "I need you to understand that sometimes my work will consume me, but that doesn't mean you're not important. I need you to keep calling me back when I start to drift away. I need you to not give up on me when I'm being impossible." "Okay," Iris said simply. "I can do that. But you have to do something for me, too." Anything. You have to keep choosing this. Choosing us. Even when it's hard. Even when it would be easier to just retreat into your tower and pretend you don't need anyone. You have to keep showing up. I will, Octavia promised. I am. That's why I'm here. They sat together in the dark apartment, watching the city lights through the window, and Octavia felt something settle in her chest. This was what love looked like in practice. Not the grand gestures or the perfect moments, but the choice to keep showing up even when it was messy and complicated and scary. The patent case eventually settled. Octavia's company survived, though bruised and reorganized. Through it all, she kept her promise. She showed up. She let Iris see her exhausted and frustrated and occasionally defeated. She learned to ask for help, to admit when she was overwhelmed, to accept comfort without feeling like she was admitting weakness. Spring came, and with it, changes. Margaret's health deteriorated. She moved from the care facility to hospice, and Iris spent most of her time at her mother's bedside. Octavia rearranged her schedule, delegated more to her team, and sat with Iris during the long vigils, holding her hand, bearing witness to the slow process of letting go. Margaret died on a Sunday morning with Iris and Octavia both present. Her last words were to Iris, "Keep painting, keep seeing the light, keep living." The grief was massive and complex. Iris cried for days, then didn't cry at all for weeks. She painted furiously, then couldn't touch her brushes for a month. Octavia learned that there was no fixing this, no strategy that would make it better. She could only be present, could only sit with Iris in the vast emptiness that loss created. "I thought losing Luna was the worst thing that could ever happen to me," Iris said one evening, months after Margaret's death. "I didn't think I could survive another loss like that. But you know what I've realized? Love doesn't make loss worse. It makes it bearable. Because I'm not alone in this grief. You're here, holding it with me." They were sitting on their bench, the one where it had all started. The city moved around them, indifferent to their pain and their healing, and Octavia thought about how much had changed since that first morning, when she'd noticed a woman sitting still amid the chaos. "I love you," Octavia said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, though she'd felt it for months. "I love you in ways I didn't know I was capable of loving anyone. You've changed me, changed how I see everything." Iris turned to her, eyes bright with tears, and something that looked like joy. "I love you too. You've shown me that it's possible to let someone in again, even after loss. That it's worth the risk." They sat together, as the light did whatever it was that Iris found so extraordinary, and Octavia finally understood what she'd been seeing all those mornings. It wasn't just about the angle of the sun or the way it hit the buildings. It was about being present enough to notice, about slowing down enough to see. It was about finding beauty in a world that was constantly trying to convince you that only productivity and efficiency and winning mattered. A year after they met, Octavia made a decision that shocked her board and made headlines in the business press. She stepped down as CEO, staying on as chairman, but bringing in a new leader to run day-to-day operations. She restructured her life, creating space for things that weren't about acquisitions or quarterly returns. She and Iris moved in together, to a loft in Brooklyn with windows that faced east and caught the morning light. Octavia learned to paint, badly but enthusiastically. Iris started selling her work for what it was actually worth, with Octavia's guidance on negotiating with galleries. They built a life that was messy and imperfect, and infinitely more real than anything Octavia had known before. They still went to their bench sometimes, early in the morning, to watch the light on the buildings. But now Octavia saw what Iris had always seen. Not monuments to power and achievement, but questions asking themselves over and over. What are we building? Why? For whom? And at what cost? The answer, Octavia had learned, wasn't found in boardrooms or business strategies. It was found in moments like this. Sitting beside someone you loved, watching the world wake up, choosing to be present for whatever came next. It was found in the willingness to be seen, to be vulnerable, to let someone else hold your heart, even though you knew it could break. Years later, when Octavia was asked in an interview what had led to her stepping back from her company, she surprised the journalist by saying, I met someone who taught me that there are different ways to measure success, different kinds of wealth, different definitions of what it means to live well. The journalist pressed for more details, but Octavia just smiled and changed the subject. Some things she'd learned were too precious to explain to people who wouldn't understand. Some things existed in the private spaces between two people who'd chosen each other, who kept choosing each other, day after day, even when it was hard. That evening, she came home to find Iris in their studio, painting one of her distorted cityscapes. She wrapped her arms around Iris from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder, watching the brush move across the canvas in strokes that bent reality into something more honest. "What are you painting?" Octavia asked. "The view from our bench," Iris said. "The way the light hits the buildings. The way it makes them look like they're asking questions." Octavia smiled, recognizing the scene that had started everything. "And what's the answer?" she asked. "To the questions the buildings are asking?" Iris leaned back into her embrace. "I think the answer is that we're not meant to have all the answers. We're meant to live in the questions, to let them shape us, to be brave enough to not know." She paused, adding a stroke of gold to the canvas. "We're meant to find people who'll sit in the uncertainty with us, who'll see the light when we forget to look for it, who'll remind us that we're alive, not just existing." Octavia held her tighter, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. She'd spent so much of her life seeking certainty, building structures that would protect her from chaos and vulnerability. But standing here, in this studio that smelled of paint and possibility, holding this woman who'd taught her how to see, she understood that the uncertainty was where real life happened. The mess was where love grew. The questions were more valuable than any answer she could have calculated. Outside their windows, the city continued its endless transformation, building and breaking and building again, full of millions of people seeking their own answers, fighting their own battles, learning their own lessons about what mattered. And somewhere in all that chaos, on a bench on Madison Avenue, the morning light was hitting the buildings at just the right angle, turning them into questions that would wait patiently for anyone brave enough to sit still and listen.